during this lecture, we're going to look at why shelter is a priority. Now, I'm going to build on foundational knowledge and a little bit of assumption. I'm assuming that most people understand, at least in concept, why shelter in wilderness survival is a priority. So basically, normally we have a number of priorities, and these relate to the base human requirements to keep a human being alive, so life support requirements. So shelter is usually at the top in most environments, unless we have something that is already providing that particular attribute. And then normally it's water, fire, food. And those bottom three can be malleable, depending on what resources and situation I particularly find myself in. The take-home message is simple though. I need to have those four dynamics, particularly shelter, water and food, in play. Otherwise, I'm going to compromise the health and wellness of my body, and sometimes very quickly. Shelter becomes the dominant need for that reason, because we have a very short, narrow bandwidth that we can tolerate in terms of the fluctuation of temperature range at a core body temperature level. So I'm not referring to what you'd feel with your hand in a topical type of measure. I'm talking about core body heat of a human being. So most of the time we prefer to be around about 37 degrees Celsius. That is our happy place. Now if we get too hot or too cold, we can only really move 2 degrees either side of 37 degrees, depending on specific conditions and a little bit of individual variability. But it's really basically about a 4 degree span or bandwidth of fluctuation that we can control and measure our normal thermoregulation. When we step outside of that, we hit what I call tipping points. Okay, now tipping points are simply where I can take action as I'm descending into hypothermia, so getting too cold, my body's dropping towards 35 degrees Celsius, which is the designation metric for hypothermia. When I'm on my way downwards to that space, I can still take some corrective action. Once I get to that point, I'm usually fairly useless. This is a human generic thing. We are all fairly useless at that temperature. We can't think clearly, we become confused, we make poor decisions, and so on, so on, so on. And as a consequence, I need assistance in the main at that level. So that's why I call it a tipping point. Now, if I don't get assistance, and I collapse, or go to sleep, or become unconscious, I continue to go downwards until I am no longer a viable organism. All right? So that's what happens in hypothermia. The same is conversely true for hyperthermia. So as my body spirals upwards in terms of body heat and is unable to shed that excess heat, I become more agitated, angry, frustrated, confused, and so on until I get to a point, again, a tipping point. Now 39.9, let's call it 40 degrees, is about where most adult human beings are going to come into a crisis point. So this is the next tipping point on the upward spiral. Now beyond that point, I start to move into things like heat stroke. So my ability to regulate my body temperature has completely collapsed. I will stop perspiring, and we lose a lot of our body heat through the process of convection, which we achieve through perspiration. So by having a light layer of moisture on my skin, breeze or even still air can convect away some of my heat. That's why our blood vessels have all the capillary construction that they have in our body, particularly our arms and legs. That's why long, lanky people shed heat more readily than short, stocky people. It's just a purely surface area contextual concept. Right? So this tipping point means I am no longer able to self-help either, and I require someone to sit me down, calm me down, give me a drink of water, and start to increase the surface area and convect water, or keep me moist and damp, so water is taking away that heat as it convects away in the atmosphere. So that's how we do it. Now, when we're in a survival crisis, and the weather is particularly challenging, we need to do one of these two things all the time. depending on the particular circumstance. We need to either keep ourselves warm and protect ourselves, or keep ourselves cool and protect ourselves. Now, in the harsh Australian arid outback, we often need to do both at once, because at night it drops to 0 degrees in some places, in very, very remote areas, and during the day we're in temperatures, external temperatures, upwards of 50 degrees. So it's this contrast, and our bodies are really quite poor at adapting to it rapidly, particularly if we're under stress. So we need to protect that 4-degree parameter all the time. From the cold side of things that will help us or help us to understand what we need to do. If we are wet, remember we've discussed that convection is how we lose heat. So if I'm trying to keep warm, I need to stay dry and I need to stay out of the wind. So if I build a shelter, its two dominant purposes need to be to keep me out of the wind and to keep me dry if I'm in a wet and cold environment. Now, if I can achieve insulation as well, which helps me make an airspace around me that my body heat can shed heat into and I can retain it, that will also help me keep warm. It's like being inside a sleeping bag. That's the basic premise of how they work. I keep the airspace and the pockets that are formed by the material or the vegetation or anything else around me is filled with my body heat, which is then retained to some extent. Or it's bled off to the external environment in a much slower rate. Now when I'm looking at keeping cool, I want to do the same but opposite things. I want to basically protect myself, which is the sameness, but from the sun and from the heat. Now hot windy days can be very, very drying. They can dehydrate and desiccate me very quickly. So I again need to be out of the wind. But I want enough breeze to make sure that I can still, as I sweat, I'm still convecting away heat. And I want to be in shade. Okay, so I wouldn't necessarily close in the sides of a shelter in a very hot set of conditions, would I? So I just want sun shelter most of the day. Open sides to allow the breeze to come in, but I want to stay away from those really hot, dry winds. So we're using shelter as a consequence to manage this 4 degrees of fragility that a human being experiences. Keeping in mind, if we have only got the clothes we're standing up in, we don't have a lot of resilience in that space. So we need to make sure that we can modify the external environment to manage these needs. The use of clothing is our first line of shelter. So if I'm in a completely primitive environment, in terms of I've just busted out of a POW camp, I'm essentially naked, one of my highest priorities is to get myself some layer of shelter, whether it's vegetation, animal skins, which is a lot of work to actually achieve, or I need to scavenge something else that's going to make some kind of shelter for me, or worst case, I put up with it until I can stop and I construct a shelter. And then I use that construction to help me manage my core temperature. So in summary, we need to construct shelter, and shelter remains a survival priority because we have such a narrow bandwidth of fluctuation of our core body temperature before we hit these tipping points and become unworkable. So we need to keep a firm grip on this 4 degrees of variability in human core temperature. That is why shelter is always usually the top priority in most survival situations.